This is my favorite kind of pulpit right here. It's a music stand. Any fans of stand-up comedy in here? Any fans of Louis C.K. in here? Yes. Yes, a lot of hands. That's fantastic. All right. Louis C.K. is this comedian that I keep talking about with Emily Joy and Tom and Andrea and other people close to me because he does all this stuff that I just think is great and I just want to share about it. And a lot of the stuff that I think he does that's great is not stuff that I'm going to do a lot of talking about on Facebook per se because it's profane or because there's words that are, content that's a little bit risque, a little unbecoming of a pastor to be, putting on their page, or some people sort of assume. So Louis C.K. is this comedian. He's mid-40s. He's divorced. He has 2 daughters who are probably, 7 and 11, somewhere in there. He lives by himself in an apartment in New York City, and he has joint custody of his daughters, so every week they go to their mom's house and then they come back to his place. And that's a very similar arrangement that my parents had, custody of my brother and I. But he talks about being a parent. He talks about just observations of society. I really dig this guy. He's got a show called Louis. All right? And in this show, there's all these great different scenarios that he kind of gets into. But his show is basically a version of himself. It's kind of semi-autobiographical because he's playing a dad his age who's divorced with 2 daughters, who also is a comedian. It's like a lot of similar stuff, but he writes it all. And there's this episode in the show where his sister comes to visit him, and she, while that she's there visiting, has this major sort of health scare in the middle of the night. And she just starts screaming and just really loudly, at like 1 in the morning or something. And like the neighbors wake up and they come and they knock on his door. And so she's screaming and they're just pounding on the door, and he's like just really beside himself. He can't figure out what to do. And he finally answers the door and he's like, "What?" And they're like, "We're here to help." And he's just so, like, he doesn't even know these neighbors. He doesn't know who they are. And so he's just, he doesn't know what to do with it. But they end up helping him. They take her to the hospital. It's all okay in the end. But at the very end of this whole, frantic, frenetic scenario of an emergency trip to the hospital, Louis C.K. tells one of the guys who came from next door, he has this encounter, this conversation with them, and I'm going to read part of it here. So Louis says, "I couldn't have gone through that without you. I was really scared, and you weren't." And then Pedro, the neighbor, says, "That's because she's not my sister. That's why you need good neighbors, people who are not in your family to help you when you need it." And then Louis said, "But I didn't even know you guys were there." Will you pray with me? God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations on all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. For you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I didn't even know you guys were there. And then we heard in our text today this question that I think comes from a similar place. Wanting to justify himself, the lawyer asks Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" Who is my neighbor? Now, he's a lawyer, And in other gospel translations, this guy's a scribe. We can assume that this is somebody who knew the law, who knew the laws. And in the laws, there are some interesting things to say about neighbors. When we go to the book of Leviticus, Jesus actually, this is actually the source that the man used when he said, love your neighbor as yourself. That is a quote that comes out of the 19th chapter of the book of Leviticus. And it says, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. It's one of the laws from Leviticus. And then a few verses later, we have this interesting thing that evokes the same language. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So this lawyer, he knew the law. He knew the directive to love your neighbor as yourself. He probably also knew this piece about the loving the alien among you as yourself. And yet, wanting to justify himself, he asks Jesus, who is my neighbor? He's doing this because he wants to narrow the scope of his faithful responsibility. He wants to narrow the scope. I know that you talked about loving all of those aliens, everyone who might come to visit from somewhere else. I know you mean love my neighbors all around me, but that's feeling like it's too much responsibility to take on. I don't want to love that many people. Really, 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 who is my neighbor? He's trying to narrow the scope of his responsibility. And then what Jesus did instead was widen the scope entirely in his answer. He gave this story about how that somebody was in need of help, and instead of getting help from his neighbors, like the priest and the Levite and the judge and the people that were part of his community, he got help from someone outside his community, from one of these aliens, right? That was the one who treated him like a neighbor. So the lawyer went in trying to narrow the scope of neighborness, and instead Jesus widened it to include even those people that you don't trust, those neighbors to the north, those people who are religiously and culturally opposite to you. I think the lawyer was trying to narrow the scope because he wanted to justify why he had not up until that point lived in to the true calling of the love of God for all people. It says that he was wanting to justify himself. It sounds like he had some things in mind that he was struggling with when it came to other people, when it came to truly opening his heart and loving other people. He was trying to justify himself and make the scope narrow. Who is my neighbor? He didn't know who his neighbor was. So it's one thing to point back in time at that guy and say, ha ha, you got fooled by Jesus. Ha ha ha, aren't we better than you? But then I begin thinking about the way we have neighbors today. And we have neighbors in our community, on our street, and we have neighbors, other nations with whom we share borders. And I think this question of who is my neighbor still rings true to today. Do we really know who our neighbors are? How many people here are willing to admit that they are not on a first-name basis with at least one of their immediate surrounding neighbors? Yeah. I know a couple of them, but I don't know all of them. We don't know who our neighbors are, even in the same way that this guy maybe did in his time. And how many of us know somebody who immigrated to the U.S. from somewhere else? So we have that experience, some of us. How many of you know any of these children who have come here, these 50,000 or so kids that are now here? Yeah. So there's the neighbors we know, and then there's the neighbors we don't know. And there's, I think, a lot of reason why, when it comes to pouring out the love of God for them, that we can come up with excuses to try and justify why we should narrow that scope. I mean, we're seeing a lot of that this past week in political discourse, right? A bunch of politicians talking about how we can kind of narrow that welcome, narrow that scope for very, seemingly legitimate reasons. There's a lot of reasons we can justify ourselves, right? We don't have enough money to fully care for all of these kids, or hey, these people in our town don't have jobs. Maybe we should focus on them instead of all of these folks over here. We're justifying ourselves. Or it's not our job, it's the parent's job to take care of the kids. What kind of parent would send their child unaccompanied across the border anyway? Right? They must be bad parents, so it's not our responsibility. We're trying to justify ourselves to narrow the scope of what our love response should be. But God is not in the business of narrowing love. God's love is ever widening, ever expanding. 2,500 years ago was pushing people into outside their borders and taking in their neighbors from the north and the east and the west, the aliens who weren't part of their culture. God was saying, bring them in and love them. And to this day, God demands the same from us. Jesus, in our text, doesn't use the example of the holy roller in town as the one that saves the local guy. He doesn't say, the preacher, in his benevolence, scooped the man up and came and faith healed him at the altar. He didn't say that. He said that the foreigner came and that the foreigner was like the neighbor. Jesus is in the business of expanding our scope for how we should respond in love. So the good news for us is that God's love is wide enough for them out there and wide enough for each of us in here. I think for some of us, it's easier to love others out there than it is to love ourselves, to imagine that God has big, ever-widening love for each of us too. But God's love is ever expanding. It's not narrowing. It's not diminishing and decreasing. God's love is expansive and wide. It compels us outward. It compels us to say yes to the movement of God's love in other people, to love and serve those beyond our arbitrary boundaries. And in so doing, we encounter the love that God has for us, too. Louis C.K., in his dialogue, has that back and forth with Pedro, and then he says, I didn't even know that you guys were there. Pedro says, you didn't, but now you do. Now you know who your neighbors are, and don't forget it. Friends, Our neighbors are the ones who bear the image of God, the ones with whom we experience the love of God. No boundaries, no limits. Amen.